Hello, everybody, and welcome to this new edition of The Notebook. I am Marc-Antoine Godin with Arpin Basu on February the 10th. That's Monday's edition of The Notebook. The Canadiens, Arpin, are on vacation. We are not.
It's Four Nations face-off. Catch the fever.
I know. So we're going to continue our shows during the Four Nations face-off. Listen. A lot to talk about today. There's been drama going on. But before we get into like juicy topics like Jake Evans trade rumors and Slav and whatever, maybe just a quick recap on the weekend, because it seemed to me like the Canadiens were back in a very positive way in the process side of things. Versus they did not get the result, but their process is getting better. But the problem is that they're running out of time, and they're out of time completely just satisfy themselves with the fact that their process is getting back on track. They need results, and they're not getting them.
Well, they needed results, and they did not get them. Past tense. It's
okay, fair enough.
Fair enough. it's in my opinion, at least. It's like, and Marty actually kind of bristled at that notion. He was asked by Jeremy Filosa after the game yesterday against Tampa, if he felt that these two games were kind of the last chance to convince Jeff Gorton and Ken Hughes to choose a course of action ahead of the trade deadline or what have you. And he kind of bristled at it. I think I imagine Marty had read some of the coverage heading into the weekend that suggested that was the case. And he was just kind of like, oh, it's just two games. There's not like, it's more than two games that they take into account. If we win the two games coming out of the break, is that going to change their mind? It's all the games. It's not just these two games that mattered, but it's fine for him to think that. But those two games were kind of a last chance to make a point, to be like, okay, like let's at least give Gordon and Hughes some pause in terms of selling, which he's probably right in the sense that even had they won those two games, they were probably verging on being sellers anyway.
Yeah.
That would just give them some reason to kind of consider not selling. But obviously losing both games kind of cements that, and the Canadiens are going to be sellers at the deadline. I think it's pretty obvious at this point. But what's interesting, and you talk about the process, right? So like I do, I'm on the Habs on TSN broadcast. And so, Frank Corrado, or the friend of the show, the guy who he was on our show, after the game on Saturday, he's like, "Hey, do you get these Sport Logic reports that we get after games?" I was like, "No." Could you send me one? It's like, yeah. So he sent me the one. He sent me the Sport Logic game report after the game against New Jersey and after the game against Tampa. And in both cases, all of the sort of metrics that Sport Logic tracks were heavily tilted in the Canadiens' favor. Just as an example, against Tampa, right? Expected goals, 4.58 to 3.51 in favor of Montreal. Offensive zone possession time, 8:28 for Montreal, 6:04 for Tampa. Slot shots on net, 14-12. Slot driving plays, 42-20. High danger scoring chances, 22-10. Scoring chances off the cycle, 13-5. Controlled entry success rate, 69.8% for Montreal to 47.2% for Tampa. Like and that's at all strengths. I mean, really, and at even strength, same deal. The big one in both cases, game against Jersey, the game against Tampa, the only area where Montreal was deficient was odd man rushes. Gave up more odd man rushes to the opposition than they got themselves. And, they still generated what? They generated 3 odd man rushes against Tampa, gave up 6. And it was just massive mistakes that led to goals. But really, if you're evaluating how the team played and the run of play, they played super well. But as you mentioned, playing super well, coming away with 0 points on the weekend just didn't cut it. Wasn't good enough, and that's going to set in motion, uh, you know, a course of action for the trade deadline that was already probably set in motion, but I think that finalized it.
I like that you bring up Marty's reaction to Jeremy Filosa's question, because he really,
Yeah,
yeah, he almost took it personal in the way that he
yeah.
reacted. But it's
He
interesting.
it was overly abrasive, you know.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah,
but he finished it with with sort of a half laugh. But what's interesting about this dynamic this year, and I guess it's the same during Olympic years, is that you're in a situation where the trade deadline is pretty much a month away, but it's also 6 games away. So those
yeah.
are two very different parameters. So when you are basically 2 weeks without playing a single game, and you have your bosses who are simmering into these bad results of late and are left pondering for 2 weeks about what they should do next, and they plan and they establish different scenarios, they decide on courses of actions and stuff like that. um, the month period is very different to having only 6 games, because 6 games is not a
Mm-hmm.
lot. And when Marty says, well, every game is important and we have big games coming up, yeah, that's true. But there's really not that many games that could potentially, there's not enough games to change the Canadiens' fortune in the standings before the trade deadline. So there's ample time, but there's not enough games. So that's why I think that it's pretty irreversible as to, the choices that they're going to make in terms of what do we do with our guys. And to
Well,
that
what?
end,
Well, just to add to that, sorry, but the other dynamic here that's I think important, and I was talking to someone at the game last night, and we kind of brought this up, is that there are other teams like the Canadiens, right? There are other teams that considered themselves contenders, were considering the possibility of not selling, that are going to start to drop off and become sellers. And
Mhm.
the more of those teams that enter the fray, uh, the more competitive the selling market becomes. Because right now it's a seller's market, right? There are more buyers than there are sellers. A lot of the obvious sellers have already sold their play. Chicago's sold Taylor Hall. They don't really have that many other guys that teams would want. San Jose sold Granlund and CC. They don't really have that many other guys that teams would want.
Philly,
Pittsburgh has sold
Philly,
their two main guys. Philly had made more of a hockey trade, but still sold the guys that they wanted to get rid of. But yeah, so in terms of like sheer availability of players to the teams that are looking to buy, there's not that many right now. There's not that many of those players. Like obviously Seattle's verging on being one of those teams. Anaheim is right there. They could be one of those teams. St. Louis could enter the fray. They're 8 points out of a playoff spot at the break. They're probably one of those teams. Utah could become one of those teams. Like there's a lot of Western teams that have only recently kind of entered selling mode, right?
yeah.
And the more of those teams that enter, the more difficult to become. Like you think of, and so that just adds to the dynamic in the sense that like when the Canadiens traded Sean Monahan, they did so in an effort to jump the market, right? To make sure that we get our price for our guy, and they created like an artificial kind of pressure point. They sort of made it clear to teams that once Elias Lindholm got traded to the Canucks, okay, now is the time. Like Sean Monahan's available right now. I will do it for this price. Goes to whoever chooses to meet that price gets him, right? Jets
Mm.
met the price, they got him. The Canadiens, I think, have to look at the period coming out of Four Nations and maybe even the period during Four Nations, even though I think there's sort of like a handshake agreement between teams not to sort of take the attention away from the tournament and start like making trades during the tournament. There's very little incentive to do so, but still they're going to be talking trades. I feel like more than in addition to there be only 6 games to the deadline, there's an additional pressure point being added in the sense that the Canadiens might want to act before these other sellers enter the fray and start messing up the market for them.
Yeah, well, I think that the buyers are more in a situation where it's interesting for them to
To wait.
go early, to act early rather than
Oh yeah.
sellers. Because if you take, for example, a team like Dallas, who acquired Granlund and Cody Ceci. So Ceci
Mm-hmm.
the Stars needed a right-handed shot on defense. They did not. There was not a lot of choices. We discussed it in the previous episode, mentioning Savard, mentioning Jan Ruta, and Cody Ceci's different profile of defensemen. But they had an urgent need, and they looked as though if they identified that guy, they were not going to risk that the prices would go up, and they acted quickly. Look at the
Mm.
Canadiens. The way
They
that
also
it's
got a legit. They also got a legit top six forward in that trade. I mean, they
well,
got San Jose's leading
he's
scorer.
the
Yeah,
biggest. He's the biggest part of that deal.
yeah.
There's no doubt about it. But I think that for Montreal, there is a value in waiting a little bit and get the prices go up because of the rarity of what they've got to offer. I think that when you look at the fact that Brock Nelson, there are rumors that he might be resigning with Long Island. Yanni Gould is injured and he's not going to be back
That's also
before trade deadline. And there's other centermen that have moved. So in terms of centermen on expiring contracts, there's not a lot of guys out there that are necessarily better or have more value than Jake Evans. So the Canadiens are in a position where they can potentially create a little bit of an auction for him. So that's why rushing to move him right away might not be the best course of action. And you mentioned the other teams that were like falling in the West. I look at Utah mainly as probably the team that would be the one that would have the similar assets to offer, because the Canadiens have Evans and Dvorak, while Utah
mm-hmm.
have Kerfoot and Bustad. The Canadiens have Savard on defense. Utah has Ian Cole. They've got Olimata also. So in terms of what you can offer to other teams at the deadline, they seem to be in a rather similar place.